Hello, and welcome to Paint the Past. I'm your host, Amorous. The face I'm painting today belonged to a Roman empress. She was probably in her mid-teens when this portrait was made, and she'd been married to the heir to the Roman Empire for only a short while. She has the composed, slightly distant look that Roman sculptors gave to imperial women. Dignified, idealized, a public image more than a private person. The reference photo I'm using today is one of my own. Her name was Fulvia Plautilla, and she was the Empress of Rome for almost exactly 3 years, from April 202 to January 205 CE. After that, she spent 6 more years in exile on a small volcanic island off the coast of Sicily, surviving on reduced provisions, probably in poverty, certainly in fear. And then, in 211 CE, she was killed. She was in her mid-20s. The story of how she went from a lavish imperial wedding to a lonely death on a remote island is, even by the standards of the Roman imperial court, a remarkable sequence of events. It involves one of the most powerful men in the empire, one of the most consequential marriages in Roman history, a political murder in the imperial palace, a long and bitter exile, and a final act of violence that followed her husband finally becoming sole emperor. To understand it all, we have to start with her father. Plautilla's father, Gaius Fulvius Plautianus, is one of the more extraordinary figures in Roman imperial history. He had grown up in Leptis Magna, on the North African coast in what's now Libya, and had known the future emperor Septimius Severus since childhood. They may have come from the same city, and some ancient sources suggest they may have been related. When Severus came to power in 193 CE after a brutal civil war, Plautianus rose with him, becoming commander of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguard, and the most powerful military posting in Rome. From there, Plautianus accumulated power at a pace that made almost everyone around him nervous. The historian Cassius Dio, who was a senator during this period and watched events unfold with professional dismay, describes him as someone who wanted everything, asked everything from everybody, and would take everything. He left no province and no city unplundered. He was given the rank of consul, unusual for someone from the equestrian class rather than the senatorial nobility. His statues were erected alongside those of the imperial family. Contemporary observers noted with some alarm that his power was effectively greater than that of the emperor's 2 sons combined. He was also, by multiple accounts, deeply hostile toward the empress, Julia Domna, the Syrian-born wife of Severus, one of the most politically astute women in Roman history. Plautianus worked to undermine her with the emperor, reportedly having women tortured to unearth compromising information about her private life, and conducting what amounted to an extended campaign to cut her out of imperial decision-making. According to Cassius Dio, when Julia Domna found herself unable to match Plautianus in court politics during the height of his power, she withdrew from political affairs entirely and devoted herself to philosophy. She assembled a circle of thinkers, scholars, and sophists around her and became what people later called the philosopher empress. She was biding her time. The plan Plautianus had to cement his position permanently was to marry his daughter Plautilla to the emperor's heir. If Plautilla became empress and had children, her father's bloodline would run through the next generation of the imperial family. He would be grandfather to future emperors. It was, as power plays go, not a bad one. The wedding took place in April 202, during the celebrations marking Severus's 10th anniversary as emperor. It was a lavish public event, as befitted the occasion. The marriage of the crown prince to the daughter of the most powerful man in Rome. The dowry that Plautianus provided for his daughter was, according to Cassius Dio, equal to the combined dowries of 50 women of royal birth. He wanted everyone to understand the scale of what he was doing. The problem was that Caracalla, the emperor's son, whose real name was Lucius Septimius Bassianus, Caracalla being a nickname he acquired from the style of cloak that he preferred wearing, despised the entire arrangement. He was about 14 years old at the time of the wedding, hot-tempered, and not inclined to conceal his feelings. He hated his father-in-law. He reportedly hated Plautilla too. Ancient sources record that he threatened openly to kill both of them as soon as he had the power to do so, and that he refused to eat or share a bed with her. One source suggests that he avoided having children with her deliberately. Whatever the truth of the specific allegations, and Cassius Dio, our main source, had his own biases and didn't always distinguish between fact and rumor. The marriage was, by every account, a disaster from the start. There's some evidence, in the form of coins, suggesting Plautilla may have had a daughter in 204, but many historians also suspect that it may just have been an instance of wishful thinking on the part of whoever was designing the coins. Regardless, the daughter's name is lost, and she disappears from the record. And the marriage generated none of the dynastic continuity that Plautianus had been counting on. What it generated instead was 3 years of simmering fury and a husband who spent those years thinking of ways to get rid of his father-in-law. By the end of 204, the coalition against Plautianus was forming. Julia Domna, who had spent several years studying philosophy while she waited, was moving back into the picture. Caracalla, who had never stopped plotting, was ready. And Septimius Severus's own brother, who was dying, had apparently told the emperor before he died that he had been wrong to trust Plautianus so completely. What happened on the 22nd of January, 205 CE, is one of those Roman stories where the ancient sources don't fully agree, and where the truth is probably somewhere between the two competing accounts. According to Herodian, a military tribune reported to Caracalla that Plautianus had given him written orders to assassinate the emperor and both his sons. Caracalla brought this accusation to his father. According to Cassius Dio, who was a more skeptical and probably more reliable source, the whole thing was a setup. Caracalla had recruited 3 centurions to make false accusations, and the written orders were likely forged. Dio's version is probably closer to the truth, given that Dio did not believe that Plautianus had any real intention of murdering Severus, and given Caracalla's well-documented motivation to be rid of his father-in-law by any means available. What Dio actually describes in his account is worth quoting for its vividness. Severus summoned Plautianus to the palace and questioned him mildly, seemingly willing to hear his defense. Then Caracalla, who could not contain himself, rushed at Plautianus, hit him with his fists, and ordered an attendant to kill him then and there. Severus, who had started to have doubts about Plautianus anyway, let it happen. And then, and this detail is almost cinematic, someone plucked a few hairs from the dead man's beard and carried them to Julia Domna and Plautilla, who were sitting together in another part of the palace, saying, "Behold, your Plautianus." Julia Domna's reaction was joy. Plautilla's was grief. They received the same news in the same moment and felt exactly opposite things. Within hours, Caracalla had the marriage annulled, accusing Plautilla of adultery. The accusation was almost certainly fabricated. Her family's properties were confiscated, and Plautilla, along with her brother, was sent into exile, first to Sicily, and then to the small volcanic island of Lipari, one of the Aeolian Islands off the north coast of Sicily. Lipari is a small island, about 38 square kilometers. It's volcanic, dramatic, and entirely isolated from the Italian mainland. Today, it's a tourist destination. In the early 3rd century, for Plautilla, it was a prison without walls. The conditions of her exile were harsh. With her father's estates confiscated, there was no private income to supplement whatever the state provided, and by all accounts, what the state provided was minimal. Ancient sources describe her as living in poverty and fear. She was a former empress, the daughter of the most powerful non-royal official Rome had produced in a generation, and she was surviving on reduced provisions on a volcanic island while her estranged husband waited for a convenient moment. The only thing keeping her alive was Septimius Severus. The old emperor, whatever his faults, had not fully believed in Plautianus's guilt. Dio notes that Severus agreed to give Plautianus a proper funeral and refused to posthumously condemn him as an enemy of the state, which he would not have done if he thought the man had genuinely tried to murder him. As long as Severus lived, Caracalla could not move against Plautilla without openly contradicting his father. So Plautilla waited, and Caracalla waited too. While she was waiting, the rest of the family was having its own difficulties. Severus was increasingly ill and increasingly concerned about what was going to happen after his death. His 2 sons, Caracalla and his younger brother Geta, who were almost exactly a year apart in age, despised each other with a fervor that made them unable to function as a family. Severus took them both to Britain in 208, along with Julia Domna, hoping that a military campaign would either mature them or at least keep them occupied. It didn't. Severus died in York in February 211, reportedly urging his sons to be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all other men. They did 2 of those 3 things. With Severus dead, Caracalla and Geta were nominally joint emperors. In practice, they could not be in the same room without guards. They divided the Palatine Palace between themselves, sealing off the connecting doors. Each ate separately, terrified of being poisoned by the other. They reportedly considered formally dividing the empire in 2, Caracalla to take Europe, Geta to take the East, but Julia Domna talked them out of it, telling them they could divide everything except her, since she could not be split in half. She was doing the only thing available to her, trying to keep the peace between her 2 sons who had hated each other since childhood. Caracalla tried to have Geta killed during the festival of Saturnalia in December of 211. That attempt failed. Geta was too well protected. So Caracalla convinced his mother to arrange a reconciliation meeting in her private apartments, presenting it as a genuine attempt to end the feud. Julia Domna, who genuinely wanted peace between her sons and may have believed it was possible, arranged the meeting. Geta came, without his bodyguard, because the meeting was in his mother's room and he thought he was safe. He wasn't safe. Caracalla's centurions were waiting. Geta was stabbed multiple times and died in his mother's arms. Cassius Dio records that Julia Domna was so thoroughly covered in her younger son's blood that she did not immediately notice that she herself had been wounded in the hand. She was not permitted to grieve publicly. Under the Damnatio Memoriae, the formal condemnation of memory that Caracalla ordered against Geta, it was dangerous even to mourn him. His face was chiseled out of portraits, his name scratched from inscriptions, his coins melted down. The Severan family portrait Tondo, which showed Severus, Julia Domna, and both sons, still survives. But where Geta's face was, there is now only a disc of unpainted wood. The erasure is visible, which makes it, in a strange way, more present than if it had been hidden. The purge that followed Geta's death extended far beyond the family. Caracalla declared that roughly 20,000 people had been supporters of his brother and had them killed. Friends, soldiers, household staff, senators who had been associated with Guetta's faction. The pretext was a conspiracy. The reality was the elimination of everyone Caracalla considered a potential threat, or simply didn't like. Plautilla had been on Lipari for 6 years when Septimius Severus died. She had no money, no political allies, no husband who wished her anything but harm. She was strangled, along with her brother, sometime into 11 CE, probably in the months immediately following Guetta's murder in December, once Caracalla had established his sole rule and could move against surviving threats without restraint. She was somewhere in her mid-20s. The exact date isn't recorded. She was simply killed and forgotten, which in some respects is a quieter fate than Guetta's theatrical erasure, and in other respects is worse. There's no famous moment of grief, no surviving family portrait with a blank space where she was. What we have left of Plautilla, apart from the historical accounts, is her portraits. And there are more of them than you might expect, given how brief her time as empress was. The marble bust in the Louvre is the most famous. She's shown with the characteristic Severan-era hairstyle, waves built up into an architectural structure above the forehead, pulled back over the ears. It's a sophisticated, formal style, the kind that required hours of preparation and probably a specialist's help. The face is young, composed, idealized in the way Roman imperial portraits always are, but not without character. Then there's this portrait, located in the Acropolis Museum in Athens, that one art critic called the most tender of her surviving images. She looks, he wrote, as though she had been granted in marble the quietude that went missing from her life. And there are the coins. Roman imperial coins are important historical documents as well as currency. They carry images and inscriptions that tell you what the regime wanted people to know about the imperial family. Coins bearing Plautilla's portrait were mostly minted during Severus's reign, and they describe her as Plautilla Augusta, Augusta being the formal title of a Roman empress. After her father's fall in 205, the minting of coins with her image stopped. She ceased to exist officially, 3 years before she actually died. There's something that stays with me about this particular story, and painting this particular face. Plautilla had essentially no agency in any of the events that defined her life. She didn't choose her father, she didn't choose her husband, didn't choose to be used as a political instrument in a struggle between two powerful men who had nothing against her personally, but found her useful as leverage. The marriage was arranged to serve her father's ambitions. The divorce was arranged to destroy him. The exile was Caracalla's revenge, not against Plautilla, but against the memory of Plautianus. Even her death was not really about her. It was a loose end being tidied up by a man who had just killed his brother and was in the process of erasing everyone connected to the people he had removed. The ancient sources are not particularly sympathetic to her. Cassius Dio calls her a most shameless creature, and attributes to her the vices that Caracalla used as his excuse for the divorce. But Dio is not a neutral observer, and his hostility to the Severan court was well known. Modern historians largely conclude that the charges against Plautilla were fabricated by Caracalla to justify getting rid of her, and that Dio was, at least in this case, just repeating propaganda. What we know for certain is that she was a teenager when she was married to a man who hated her, that she was divorced and exiled before she was 20, that she spent 6 years on an island in poverty, and that she was killed before she was 30. The portraits show a composed young woman with an elaborate hairstyle, performing the role of empress for the sculptors and the coin dies. They don't show what the life behind that composure was like. Dramatic stories like this one is why so many people find Roman history so compelling, and why I find it so uncomfortable. The faces are right there, They look like people. And when you know the story behind the face, the composure in the portrait feels less like dignity and more like the very determined effort to hold it together in a world that offered her very little reason to bother. She looks more sad in my painting than she does in the sculpture. Maybe I did that subconsciously because I knew her story. But in the end, what goes around comes around. And while stopping to have a pee on the side of the road during a military campaign, Caracalla was stabbed by one of his disgruntled soldiers. The stab didn't kill him, so his own bodyguards finished him off. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of this insanely dramatic episode of Roman imperial history. I hope you've learned that forcing children to marry against their will is a recipe for disaster. If you have ideas for artifacts and stories for me to cover in future episodes, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. See you next time.